yell?
It's quiet, but it is kind of.
Can you all hear? No?
No. Turn it to your mouth.
How about that? We had a sound test earlier. It seemed to work. Okay. Yay, we're here live in person for our first in-person lecture in 3 years. We're so happy. And we're so grateful that you guys have all joined us this evening. We are so grateful for people like you who attend our programs and support our work and care about Richmond's historic places. I am Cyan Crump, Executive Director of Historic Richmond. For those of you who do not know us, Historic Richmond is a nonprofit with a mission to preserve, protect, and promote Richmond's historic places. We particularly want to thank this evening our wonderful sponsors, Dominion Energy and TCV Trust and Wealth Management. Our lecture series is an important component of our educational mission to raise awareness and support for the value of preservation as it affects quality of life and protection of historic assets in Richmond. Now, our lecture series typically includes at least one academic topic with a focus on Richmond's architectural history, that's tonight, and at least one panel discussion focusing on a topic of contemporary relevance. We've got a calendar of events out in the hallway if you're interested in attending additional lectures. This year, our lecture series is tied closely to our new strategic plan, and through our lectures, we will highlight the relevance of historic preservation and design in addressing contemporary issues. We will also tell more stories about the people, places, and communities who may have been lost to history. That is why we are so excited about tonight's program on Gabriella Harvie Randolph Brockenbrough, Virginia's lost architectural patron. And it is fitting that we are here tonight in the Tuckahoe Women's Club. Women, individually and collectively, have played a huge role in shaping Richmond's built environment, in particular through the construction and preservation of its domestic and residential architecture, interior design, and landscape architecture. This building was built in the 20th century as a center for women to make an impact on the community. Its design and function is a reflection of Richmond's women in the 20th century. But women's leadership in design and preservation started much, much earlier than that. We could go back to the 19th century, and we can see that the first national preservation efforts were led by women when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was formed in the 1850s to preserve George Washington's home. But what of an earlier time? A time when our nation was a new one, when our fledgling federal government was brand new, when we had won one war against the British for our independence, but our prospects for success in the second were quite uncertain. Women could not vote, could not own property, could not attend college, could not hold public office. In this era, women could not make a decision without their fathers, husbands, brothers, or sons' approval or oversight. In such a time, how did women manage to have an impact? And is that impact visible today on Richmond's urban landscape? In fact, very few of the historic buildings and places of Richmond's early federal period are visible on today's urban landscape. What survives is generally the work of the starchitects of the day. These were the rock star architects who were important on the national stage and whose work in Richmond is important on a national level. When we talk about these starchitects who worked in Richmond in the first 50 years of our nation, we hear the names Thomas Jefferson, B. Henry Latrobe, Robert Mills, Maximilian Godefroy, Alexander Paris, Otis Manson, and John Notman. We see their work in the Capitol, around Capitol Square, in Court End, on Churchill, and in Monroe Ward. But you do not hear the name of a single woman. Tonight, we will change that. Tonight, we will talk about Gabriella Harvie Randolph Brockenbrough, and her impact on Richmond. And tomorrow, as you walk around Richmond's Court End and Capitol Square, perhaps you will see a bit of Gabriella visible on our urban landscape. Her hand in the design of the second Brockenbrough house, and her heart at Monumental Church. Tonight's lecturer is Edwin Slipek. He is a native Richmonder who grew up in Ginter Park. He needs no introduction really, but Eddie won't toot his own horn, so I'm going to do that for him. He's an architectural historian who is known to many of us through his critiques, articles, and columns that appeared in Style Weekly for 32 years. He currently serves as the guest columnist for Richmond BizSense, a popular online news website. Eddie is also the editor of Architecture Richmond, an online encyclopedia of design and architecture in Greater Richmond. He co-founded the platform 10 years ago. Eddie has also been an adjunct instructor in art history at Virginia Commonwealth University, where he has taught for 22 years. And until the pandemic, for 15 years, he taught VCU dual credit classes in art history, as well as courses in architecture and Richmond history at our regional Maggie Walker Governor's School for Government and International Studies. And this is a big deal. I haven't seen this publicized anywhere, but on the occasion of its annual meeting in 2021, the International Council of Fine Arts Deans recognized Eddie for having ignited an ongoing interest in architecture and the built environment to students of all ages as well as the general public in the community. He received the council's periodically given award for arts and achievement and excellence. Prior recipients of this award have included Joe Riley, the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, Lewis Black, the founder of Austin's South by Southwest Festival, and Scott Shankin Peterson, former chair of the National Endowment of the Arts. Eddie is a former trustee of Historic Richmond and has been awarded honorary memberships in both the Richmond chapter of the American Institute of Architects as well as the Virginia Society of the AIA. Most recently, working with Historic Richmond, he's completed a draft biography of 20th century Virginia architect Duncan Lee. Tonight, he shares his findings on the life and times of another historically elusive figure, Gabriella Harvie Randolph Brockenbrough, of the late 18th and early 19th century. So Eddie will join us now at the podium, and he'll give a wonderful presentation. Afterwards, we are delighted to have you join us for a reception, and Eddie will be delighted to follow up on any questions you may have in the reception room. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyan. I was waiting for her to reappear. Thank each of you for being here, and I would also like to extend great thanks to the wonderful staff at Historic Richmond that's worked so hard to make tonight possible. I would also like to thank two parties for their help in tonight's presentation particularly, and they would be guests here tonight, Sue and Tad Thompson of Tuckahoe in Goochland, and also to Jenny Joyce of the staff at Historic Richmond, who helped greatly in the research for the images and the preparation of the audio-visual tonight. So thank y'all both very much. You might have caught a New York Times article about 2 weeks ago in the travel section. It was headlined, quote, "For Richmond, a compelling new chapter." Quote, "Visitors will find a Monument Avenue devoid of Confederate statues, a lively dining scene, more Black-owned restaurants, and exhibitions that take on the city's complicated past." Well, we're not at an exhibition tonight, but at a talk, and I'm going to suggest that one of those issues that might be discussed is the history and the provenance of the architectural design of the White House of the Confederacy at 1200 East Clay Street. Next image. This house was erected in 1817 by Gabriella and John Brockenbrough. And it is more famous, of course, as being the White House of the Confederacy from 1861 to 1865. But as we look at the history of this house, and arguably one of the most famous houses in American history, and arguably the most famous house in Richmond's history because of its association with the Confederacy and with the Civil War, the question remains up here in 2023, who was the architect of this structure? We can name the architects for 10 or 15 prominent buildings in the neighborhood, but this seems to elude us. Let's get out of the way right away that it has often been Robert Mills, America's first native-born architect, who designed this gorgeous Greek revival structure. But there is scant evidence to prove that point. And so that's what we're tackling tonight. And as we begin our exploration, we need to think about the fact that architects, as we would define them up here in 2023, is very different from how an architect might have been considered back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In fact, Carl Lounsbury, the terrific architectural historian, in his terrific book, The Chesapeake House, talks about the early development of architecture in the James River region, as in the other areas of our state that feed into the Chesapeake Bay. And he says, quote, "The design process at that time was a collective endeavor that involved numerous individuals who had the ability to shape the form of a structure at various stages during the construction of a building, from initial discussions to the final coat of paint. Rather than a static method whose source emanated from the architect's drawings and a set of written specifications, the conceptualization and execution of a building's design, from its plan to its ornamentation, was far more fluid, as clients, contractors, and craftsmen played important and often variable roles in this process." And so we must keep that in mind. What we're going to attempt this evening is to weave together various elements to see if we can come closer to who designed this building. And I will jump ahead and say, I think we know that I have a woman named Gabriella Jones Harvie Randolph Brockenbrough on my mind. Next picture. Now, of course, the White House of the Confederacy is greatly known to the world as the place where on April 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln and his son Tad disembarked. It was their destination, having disembarked down at Rocket's Landing and walking from that spot up the hill to the corner of Clay and 12th Streets. Lincoln wanted to sit in the chair. He wanted to sit at the desk from which Jefferson Davis had presided. They arrived fairly unnoticed, but the word got out during their brief visit that spring morning, and when they left the White House of the Confederacy that had been evacuated 2 days earlier by Jefferson Davis, his wife Rena, and their family, along with the Confederate government for Danville, as they left the house, there were throngs. No one took an official count, but there were over 1,000, largely African Americans, out in Clay and on 12th Streets, believing that they were having an apparition, basically. How could this be Abraham Lincoln in their midst, among the embers of the burning capital of Virginia, and indeed for a day or two more, or maybe it had already given way to being the capital of the Confederacy, to Danville. So this is a very, very evocative, a very emotional time. And of course, we know that the President, Lincoln, was dead just a few days after this trip. You have the next picture, please. Another thing that we need to consider as we jump into this evening is that try as we may, it's been impossible to find a good or even a proven image of Gabriella Brockenbrough. And so this is an image that is a suggestion of Ms. Brockenbrough. It's the most attractive one we found, so we went with it. But I want you to know, that doesn't leave this room. Not that she's not attractive in this image. Gabriella Harvie was born in Richmond in 1742. She was born at her father and mother's home, which was Belvedere, a street's name for that. Their home was on the site of what is today the Virginia War Memorial. This house had been built by William Byrd III, who had inherited much of the land in this area. Then for a time, the house had been owned and occupied by Bushrod Washington and his family. He was the nephew of George and Martha Washington. It was then purchased in 1780 by John Harvie. That was the same year that the Virginia General Assembly settled down in Richmond, Thomas Jefferson having named Richmond the new capital of the new state in 1779. John Harvie came to Richmond in 1780 from the west. He had been living in the Albemarle County area in the Revolutionary War. He had fought Native Americans in Ohio and in parts of Canada. He knew the West. He was himself a son of immigrants from Ireland, but had done very, very well. But he seemed to know how to sniff the soil, and things were going to be happening in Richmond. So we got down here, bought probably the best house in what was then a town of about 300 people. And he and his wife had 6 children. So Gabriella was one had 5 siblings. And we're going to see then that not only is Mr. Harvie then as a builder and a developer, because I failed to mention that he owned 1,200 acres in what is today downtown Richmond, Oregon Hill, Monroe Ward, the Fan District, and the Randolph neighborhoods. And if we were to visit Hollywood Cemetery, the family graveyard was on that site over 100 years before Hollywood Cemetery was developed as a private burial ground. And so the Harvie plot in Hollywood is the Shroud of Turin of Richmond, shall we say, in many ways. Now, Gabriella, and this is important, not only is going to have a father who was active in developing and building the city, he is the 4th mayor of Richmond, incidentally, or he will be the 4th mayor of Richmond. But we will see this evening that she is very close to Thomas Jefferson by family connections and business connections between Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, and John Harvie back in Albemarle County. She's very close to B. Henry Latrobe, the great British architect who came to America in 1798. He was recently widowed. He was looking for a new start in a new country, figuring that this new nation would need his services. He was adept not just in architecture, but also in engineering. She might have had, indeed, a romantic interlude with Mr. Latrobe, but we'll get to that later. Alexander Paris would be an architect that will figure into our story. We know that Mr. Paris well documented the architect of our executive mansion and of the Wickham House, today a beautiful part of the Valentine installation. Then in 1817, another architect that doesn't get much play around here, perhaps is one of the missing links to our story. It's Maximilien Godefroy, a Frenchman who is escaping the French Revolution and its aftermath, comes here to attempt what the Brit B. Henry Latrobe is doing, trying to find work in a nation that needs strong, new public works. Finally, we will see that her husbands, Thomas Mann Randolph of Tuckahoe and John Brockenbrough, are also builders, and they will influence her. So from the time she was a young woman, she was around building, construction, city planning, real estate. Next picture, please. Here is Mr. Harvie. Although Mr. Harvie comes to Richmond and amasses quite a bit of land and property, as we've discussed, he never really leaves Albemarle County. And his tracts of land there rival the Jefferson family's holdings. So this will become, again, a factor. There's a lot of back and forth between the West Country and the Fall Line in Gabriella's lifetime. Next picture, please. I've mentioned that the home in which Gabriella was reared was Belvedere, and this is a watercolor done by B. Henry Latrobe years after she had left that home and moved on. But it shows, I think we can almost picture, if we are heading toward the Robert E. Lee Bridge, toward Belle Isle here, you can see the James to the left, and I think this building was pretty much located right in the middle of where Belvedere Street would be today, just a little bit to the left of the War Memorial there. B. Henry Latrobe not only brought a skill in architecture and engineering, but he was also a romantic when it came to siting his buildings in nature. And I think one of the first things we notice in this picture, even before we look at this double-decker porched house, a mansion indeed, is the wind in the trees and the clouds and the water in the distance. Next picture, please. Again, Thomas Jefferson is a big part of this story because in 1780, the year that the Harvies arrive in Richmond, Jefferson is working with other consultants and representatives on a committee of the General Assembly to figure out where to build the state capitol, how to lay out the city streets, and perhaps how to carry out other public works, including a canal system. It was Jefferson who picks the site on the top of the hill. Next picture, please. A shot of the new building, which was underway by 1785. Jefferson, as we know, was ambassador to France for President Washington, and one of the things that the Virginia General Assembly pressed upon him was, whatever you do there diplomatically, you must deliver a building, a proper building to be our capital. Interestingly, he did not pick up on the fancy current styles of Parisian architecture at the time. Jefferson thought that that would perhaps be outdated. He leapfrogged backwards, as it were, to ancient Roman times. And next picture. He sent back to Richmond a model that he had made at tremendous expense for the time, a plaster model of the temple based on the Maison Carrée, which he considered the most perfect existing form of classical architecture remaining in Europe. Next picture. Next, please. And so here we have the inspiration, and we have the model for that building. And this model would have come back to Richmond in 1785, and construction then was underway. It was completed in 1788. So remember, Gabriella moving to Richmond in 1780, her father involved in everything physical in terms of the construction of the city. She certainly would have been taken to see this model as it was displayed, to try to get the uninformed, shall we say, to be nice, in Richmond to get on board with this classical architecture. Next picture. Again, this picture was also painted by B. Henry Latrobe, just one of dozens of scenes, an almost photographic-like record that he created, although he hasn't arrived yet. Next picture, please. B. Henry Latrobe arrives in 1797. First, he lands after an arduous voyage over at Norfolk. He stays there for about a year, where he raises some fiscal support by designing a number of houses for prominent Norfolkians, and then he makes his way to Richmond because this is his destination. He seems to think that this capital city, fledgling as it was, in the largest and the wealthiest new state in the new nation, is going to need a lot of public works, and he's the man to do the job. He is put to work immediately, we can have the next picture, on the state penitentiary. I guess that tells you where the values are or where the needs are. We think crime is always at the top of the to-do list. Well, it was the first great public building built here by B. Henry Latrobe. I'll just point out a couple of things. It's a dynamic building that was located on Belvedere Street. Indeed, Mr. Harvie, and we'll see how, would be able to watch the construction of this building basically from his house because he was just down the street. One of the things that Latrobe brought was the idea of a new, not a dungeon-like prison, but a new form, which we can see as a horseshoe shape. And the guards and the administration of the penitentiary had their offices in that center section, if you will, and from their viewpoints and vantage points there, they could observe each of the individual cells which was entered or exited into the central court. So a very, very smart building. Sadly, what was left of this building, which wasn't much, was torn down in the 1990s with the expansion of some corporate buildings in that area. Of course, Gabriella certainly was not going to ignore this being in her front yard, as it were. Next picture, please. So, what of Gabriella? At age 17, remember, she is one of 6 children. She has sisters. Her father, I think we've established, is a go-getter, as an understatement, and he wants to get her settled. She's 17, and he knows of no more prominent Virginian than Thomas Mann Randolph, who lives at Tuckahoe, the great estate about a half hour today west of Richmond. And this great Georgian-style house, built in the mid-1730s, was where he resided with his wife, Anne Carey, then Anne Carey Randolph of Carey Street. She had been reared at Amp Hill here in the Richmond area. Her family and the Harvies were contemporaries, probably worked together in business functions, especially since there were coal deposits down in the Chesterfield area, and some of the first coal mines in America were on the Tuckahoe estate. So Thomas Mann Randolph was sitting on about 1,200 acres here, I believe, but he owned thousands of other acres in the west. Gabriella is 17 when she is betrothed. Can women be betrothed to men or men betrothed to women? Or are they inter-betrothed? We'll look that up. The betrothment took place. And Gabriella, therefore, didn't. Why? Because Anne Carey Randolph had passed away. And it was in 1790 that Gabriella and the widower were married. Now here's the thing. Mr. Randolph and Mrs. Randolph had 13 children. 10 of them had made it to adolescence or adulthood. Some of them were older than their new stepmother. And in the remember, the laws of primogeniture had been dissolved, were being dissolved. So the firstborn, which would have been Thomas Mann Randolph II, did not view this very happily, because there goes the fortune with the marriage to the 17-year-old. And it doesn't make his cappuccino taste any better when Thomas, Gabriella, and his father have a son, and Gabriella, to stake her turf, names that baby boy Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. So we have Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. stepbrothers now. Well, little baby Randolph Jr. doesn't really have a part to play in this at this time, but you can imagine that those other 10 stepchildren were difficult. The other thing I must mention is that Gabriella was not the least bit interested in marrying Thomas Mann Randolph. He was more than twice her age. He was about 50, 51. And she was in love with her father's bookkeeper and one of his administrative assistants, a gentleman, I think last name was Marshall, no relation to the judge. So it's kind of a tough time at Tuckahoe Plantation. Next picture, please. Now, it's an extraordinary building, and so I think she would have enjoyed that quite a bit. It's an H-shaped building. The top section is the oldest part. The lower part of the building on your screen is on the riverside, and the extended staircase goes down toward the James River. It's on a high bluff there. Again, with huge land holdings in all directions on what's called Tuckahoe Creek. There was a wonderful connector room, a great room, not unlike what we find at Stratford Hall up in Westmoreland County, that connects these two areas. But not only did Gabriella start staking her claim among the wild bunch, we can't call it the Randolph bunch because it wasn't really combined households, but in a way it was. So she went in, next picture please. She of course knew about the legacy of Jefferson. She was familiar of course with what he was doing up at Monticello through her father, and so she certainly would have enjoyed the little schoolhouse, and we can assume that her son would have studied in this little schoolhouse that's still there today. Next picture, please. But Gabriella went about changing things in the house while the children probably smacked their faces and said, "What's going on here?" She took whitewash to the black walnut floor-to-ceiling paneling in the northwest parlor on the first floor. I'm not claiming she invented the Bauhaus with this white, but this certainly got their attention. She also began adding Adamesque mantelpieces throughout the house. Children were beginning to get the picture that she was not to be dealt with. She meant business. And they fled, basically, as soon as they could, to Randolph family farms in Cumberland County. And they went to one of their farms called Bazaar, and others went to Glenavar. Next picture, please. Thomas Mann Randolph II, the Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., I will say will grow up and to become he's not quite, shall we say, shaken down by his step siblings. He will grow up to be a very distinguished figure in the War of 1812. He will achieve the rank of captain and will live into his 50s. So Gabriella seems to do a good job rearing her own son and only child who made it to past infancy, while all of his stepsisters and brothers have fled west to Cumberland County. Now, we've got to remember, these are entitled children. Some of them, the last to go was Nancy, who was 15 years old. And as the children were moving westward, Nancy remained there to be the last holdout and perhaps to defend what she thought would be her father's interests. But she would not let Gabriella in her bedroom to change the mantelpiece in that particular room. So even today, that's an outlier room at Tuckahoe. Next picture, please. Martha Washington is, Martha Jefferson, or Patsy, Thomas Jefferson's daughter, moves to Cumberland County and marries another Randolph cousin, marries Gabriella's stepson, Thomas Mann Randolph. And she is quite upset because she thought, and Mr. Jefferson thought, that they were marrying into the prosperous Randolph family. But with Gabriella holding court now, and the others basically seeking asylum up the river and in the wilderness, as it were, the farms were okay there, but they weren't doing somersaults. Martha Jefferson, living in Cumberland, writes to her father, who is in New York, trying to figure out, then the capital of the new nation. She writes to him, "Dad, what can I do? This woman is impossible. She didn't want to marry our father. She has taken everything we thought was coming to us. What shall we do?" Well, I'm going to read you a reply that Mr. Jefferson sends to his daughter from New York City, how to deal with Gabriella Randolph. Because John Harvie owned a lot of property adjacent to Monticello, and Mr. Jefferson thought that he would perhaps build a family compound on the acreage there. He would have to purchase the land from Mr. Harvie, and he didn't want to do anything to rock the boat or to get Gabriella and her people upset. So there's a little bit of, it's a little long, but stick with me because I think we get an idea of Jefferson's wisdom as well as his political astuteness in this response to his daughter Martha in 1790, the same year as the marriage. He writes his daughter, quote, Randolph is an excellent good man, to whose temper nothing can be objected, but too much facility. All his amusements depending on society, he cannot be expected to live alone. If the lady, that would be Gabriella, has anything difficult in her dispositions, avoid what is rough and attach her good qualities to you. Consider what are otherwise as simply a bad stop on your harpsichord. Jefferson continues, do not touch on it, but make happy with the good ones. Every human being, my dear, must be viewed accordingly to what is good for what it is good for. For none of us, no, not one of us is perfect. And were we to love none who had imperfections, this world would be a desert for our love. All we can do is make the best of our friends, love and cherish what is good in them, and keep out of the way what is bad. Be you, my dear, the link of love, union, and peace for the whole family. Great advice in any generation, I think. But Jefferson also brings up the fact of Mrs. Harvie. He says, and remember her mother. We do not want to, he goes on to say, we do not want to get Mrs. Harvie riled up. So evidently she had quite a stake in this as well. Meanwhile, Jefferson went back to working with his colleagues there in New York about figuring out where to place the new nation's national capital. About a day or two later, they decide on Washington, District of Columbia. I love the fact he's bringing national capital, meanwhile he's trying to calm his daughter down. Let me also mention at this point that Gabriella's son, Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., is buried in Richmond's Chaco Cemetery. The only member of that clan that I know is buried in Richmond, and indeed in downtown Richmond, Hollywood Cemetery, another matter as we've seen. Next picture. Now we've talked about B. Henry Latrobe coming to Richmond. We have him building the state penitentiary. We have Gabriella involved in running now with her husband, Mr. Randolph, huge estate. And meanwhile, her father has decided he wants to build himself a proper modern building, and so he engages B. Henry Latrobe while he's working on the penitentiary to design a house for what is today Gamble's Hill, and a house that will be built on Gamble's Hill, which is today the site of the former Ethel Corporation building, Newmarket Corporation there on that great hill. So he knew how to pick the prime real estate, did he not? And Latrobe is bringing the latest in his ideas about incorporating a cleaner, almost stripped down classicism, but also enhancing and embracing its beauty and its viability with nature. Next picture. This is the view from the James River side of the building. And so the house does not have a portico. It was designed so that the sun could hit the three main, we can see it's a 5-part building here. Only the center part of this would be built. But the center core has 3 main buildings across the back of the building on the riverside. Next picture. And we can see that here. Turn it around, the bay window faces the river, and there are 3 parlors or 3 public rooms or formal rooms that open onto each other. One enters a large oval entry hall from the land side, and this would get wonderful breezes in the summertime up perched there on the riverbank, and in the wintertime it would get maximum advantage from solar heating as well. Now, there's very little record of what happens next, but evidently Mr. Harvie, the building is underway by about 1800, and we don't know what happens, but there's a huge argument, and Mr. Harvie steps away from the project, sells the house to a General Gamble, who had been had served in the Revolutionary War, and Harvie has pretty much had it with B. Henry Latrobe. But during this process, I think B. Henry Latrobe and Gabriella had struck up a friendship, because she had married Mr. Randolph in 1790. Mr. Randolph passed away in 1793. So they were only married for 3 years. So in her early 20s, Gabriella is holding court and trying to expand and maximize the efforts up at Tuckahoe Plantation. So she engages B. Henry Latrobe to come to Tuckahoe and to try to help her figure out how to build canals to create better access to the coal deposits that are in that area. He goes and sometimes stays for days at a time. She's very flirtatious. Maybe he's there for a week. She stays in her bedroom for 3 days, passing him notes, he passing her poetry, some of it fairly erotic, under the passages. But she is evidently quite a flirt. Next picture. Now, having said that the 10 children have found her quite difficult, one cousin of theirs, John Randolph, known as Randolph of Roanoke to many folks in Virginia, is a cousin. He and his 2 brothers are very close to their cousins. The Randolph family has a family tree, but it has very few branches. Cousins are marrying cousins, and we'll leave it at that, but let's see what else happens. John Randolph thought that the Randolphs up at Cumberland County were impossible. And think about it, these were orphans, they were entitled, they were through their mother, Mrs. Carrie, Anne Carey Randolph, through their mother, they were sixth-generation direct descendants from Pocahontas and John Rolfe. They were American royalty, as it were, and they did very little to help advance the farming and the agricultural aspects of their farms in Cumberland County. John Randolph, their cousin, who was a little farther south, was always rolling his eyes and had basically said, "To hell with all of you." And he would continue his life, which would continue to be as a very excellent career in Congress, in the House of Representatives, one of the great orators in American history. He would continue to take to his grave a blood feud with his cousins there at Bazaar. And part of the problem, next picture, has to do with Anne Nancy Randolph. Here again, our great chronicler visually of the situation at that time, B. Henry Latrobe, when he would go up to visit the family and the families and the households, always had his pen and paper at the ready. And here's a sketch he did of Anne Nancy Randolph. This was the 15-year-old holdout at Tuckahoe, who was the last to leave. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore, or maybe Gabriella couldn't take her anymore, whatever. She fled up to Bazaar Plantation, and this is where B. Henry Latrobe was quite intrigued by her. She was evidently quite a live wire. But Nancy, as she was called, began having an affair with her sister's husband, Richard. Next picture, please. And this is the cover from a 1950 book called the Bazaar Sisters. And we have a depiction of Hollywood, I guess. It was never made into a motion picture, but this looks like a placard for cinema, doesn't it? But here we have Nancy Randolph and her sister Judith in the foreground, and Judith's husband Richard in the background. And in September of 1792, they were having a kind of house party, shall we say. It seems like it was sort of an animal house. They might have had a house party going all the time. And in the middle of the night, actually they were at another house party at Glendivar, at John Randolph of Roanoke's home that he had with his brother. And they heard a shriek in the night, and it was, we back up one, it was Nancy screaming, and Richard ran to her room, and she was completely distraught. And the enslaved people at the estate were hovering around. They knew something was going on. There was up and down the steps. The next morning they found blood in her room. They found blood on the steps. And the enslaved people claimed that they found the corpse of an infant baby on a stack of shingles in the woodpile. And this created a tremendous scandal that she and Richard had produced a child, and it had either been murdered or miscarried on that particular night. And the slaves and the white farmers who worked the plantations for the Randolphs and did not have perhaps great love for them began stirring the pot on this story. And it got so carried on that it made the newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, New York. And Richard, if we can go forward one, Richard came forward and admitted to having an affair with his sister-in-law. Well, they had to decide whether this was cause for a court case, And the Randolphs, being the Randolphs, figured they would get the best legal mind in the Commonwealth to defend them. And so they get John Marshall and Patrick Henry to come to Cumberland Courthouse to defend them. However, enslaved people were not allowed to be heard in court cases at that time. So there were no witnesses to any charges that could have been carried out. So the affair basically faded away. However, in that part of the world, because I've gone up to Cumberland County to beat the Bushes, they still talk about this event. I don't think there's been so much excitement since in Cumberland County. But more than that, they want to blame, and I've had women at the St. James Episcopal Church in Cartersville tell me that she blames Gabriella because it was she that had dispersed the family and created, and where such mischief could even take place. Next picture. We can move along here. I just want you to know there are over, I think, 15 books. I don't want there to be a run on the Cumberland Public Library. But the most recent, I think, is 2011, Scandal at Bazaar, which is a properly written history. But then there's some more scandalous types like the Bazaar Sisters. Next picture. Next picture, please. Now, remember, Thomas Jefferson was hoping that the Harvies were going to sell him land so he could get some of his children out of that situation and up where he could keep an eye on them. And indeed, he was successful. And Edge Hill Estate, which is very close to Monticello, becomes the home of many of these children of Thomas Mann Randolph and Anne Carey Randolph. Next picture. Now, meanwhile, Gabriella has been carrying on. The plantation has been, Tuckahoe has been doing fine. And John Randolph, remember the one member, the one cousin that seemed to be on her side, is quoted as saying in a letter, Gabriella has a mind of a very high order, well improved, and manners that a queen might envy. So good reviews from the eloquent and influential John Randolph of Roanoke. Next picture, please. Oh, I'm sorry, let's go back. So, Gabriella is now widowed. She's messing with B. Henry Latrobe, but that's not going to be. He was dirt poor at the time. And he's going to do much better, though. Look at Washington, D.C., but she marries one of the most prominent men in Richmond, Dr. John Brockenbrough. A fine family from Tappahannock area. Dr. Brockenbrough had studied medicine in Europe at University of Edinburgh. And this is a later picture of him. I don't want you to think that she only was, what's the opposite of a cougar? That she was only going for the older men. This is an actual, and we have no image of Gabriella herself. This is an image of her second husband, a daguerreotype that was taken by the president, or the project was done by the president of a major canal system of which he was on the board, and all the board members had their photographs taken with daguerreotypes showing new technology. So Dr. Brockenbrough and Gabriella, he becomes, not only is he a medical doctor, but when he marries Gabriella, he stops practice, he never sees another patient. And next picture, please. He begins handling his wife's affairs and her considerable estate, and he becomes one of the top officers in the Bank of Virginia. And so they move to Richmond, and he builds Gabriella this house in 1810 on the corner of diagonally across from the Wickham House. The Wickham House was not built when this structure was built. And the photograph we have here and the only one that I think exists, shows the house after it had been expanded. The third floor came later, and the wing on the far right came later. But I think we can get a good picture of the colonnaded front, flanked by 2 windows on each side. There had been no colossal column-fronted house in Richmond until Gabriella had her husband build her this building there in Court End on Clay Street. This later became one of the very first buildings of the Medical College of Virginia. The building has since been demolished in the 1940s. It's now, I believe, a park-like setting for the VCU Health Center. While they were living in this house, Dr. Brockenbrough had lived at Tuckahoe for the beginning of their relationship, but he took her to Europe on a honeymoon. And so Gabriella is getting out of the sticks of Richmond, as it were, although the city's evolving. She gets a taste of a European flair, and she comes back. That may have had something to do with the design of this building. That trip had been in 1798. This house is 1810. But a building that had been built a few years before this building had been the John Marshall House. Next picture, please. Which was just 3 blocks away. This built in 1799. So the Brockenbrough follow up in about 10 years with their home. This really looks quite ancient, doesn't it, compared to what Gabriella puts up there on Clay Street. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after Gabriella's seen Paris, we might ask. Next image. Now, who knew, but they had their home. They did not have the home, it was in conception stage, but in 1807, the Aaron Burr trial was held in Richmond, and the trial took place, of course, it was for treason, it was trying to establish perhaps a new nation using part of the lands of the Louisiana Purchase and farther west lands as well. And John Brockenbrough had entertained Burr and been a figure at a very controversial dinner that John Wickham had for participants in that trial, in that treason trial. John Marshall showed up, and that, of course, got national exposure. How could the judge in that great trial be having dinner with him down the street at the home of Mr. Wickham? So the Brockenbroughs were all a part of that as well. Now, next picture. Oh, well, we'll go back one, please, if you will. Now, one of the co-conspirators in that case was a gentleman, I'm not sure he was a gentleman, but his name was Harmon Biner Hassett, who was a man who had settled in the West near what is today Marietta, Georgia, or Parkersburg, West Virginia. And he had the largest home and was one of the largest landholders in the Western countries. He was a co-conspirator with Aaron Burr, very wealthy, and he was financing part of this effort to perhaps start a rebellion against the United States. And we know that Mr. Biner Hassett, although he was housed in the state penitentiary during his stay here in Richmond, was entertained the day he got out of jail by the Brockenbroughs. And he wrote later on, quote, that Gabriella Brockenbrough is the nearest approach in this town to a savant and Belle spirit, meaning a genius, basically. Some high praise from this, shall we say, potential traitor. At about the same time, her good friend John Randolph of Roanoke wrote, in all the domestic arts that give it highest value to the female character Gabriella possesses. Mr. Randolph also said of her husband, Mr. Brockenbrough is not as other men are. That gentleman stands A1 among men. Next picture, please. Now, just as the Brockenbroughs are settling into their new house on Clay Street, on December 26, 1811, one of the greatest tragedies in American history takes place with the theater fire, the Richmond Theater. And 72 Richmonders, well, 72 folks lose their lives in this particular, in this tragedy. Again, this is just right outside their front door, basically. The Brockenbroughs were not in attendance that night. It was a stellar crowd of folks. I believe it was a benefit performance, and so the ticket prices were a little higher than usual, and some of Richmond's best and brightest were there, certainly some of their richest. But Gabriella would hit tragedy again. She had already lost a daughter in childbirth, but a brother, Edwin, and a sister, Juliana, were both killed in this fire, just a few blocks from their brand new house. Also, one of her nieces was killed in this fire among those 72. Next picture, please. Most of us here know, of course, the monumental church that was erected and designed by Robert Mills, America's first native-born architect. Dr. Brockenbrough was on the committee and handled the financing and much of the fundraising for that particular project. Of course, he had a tragic personal connection to the situation with his family, his stepdaughter and stepson being killed in that. I'm sorry, brother-in-law and sister-in-law being, it gets a little confusing. So Robert Mills designs this great American landmark, maybe with the great influence of B. Henry Latrobe as well. It's never been untangled exactly what was Mills and what was B. Henry Latrobe. Next picture, please. And here's the building as it stands today, and through the wonderful auspices of Historic Richmond is getting a wonderful exterior renovation right now, and painting, and it looks terrific. And in the next picture, there's an urn there on the portico with the names inscribed of the 72 victims, black and white, free and enslaved, who lost their lives that night. Next picture. Now, getting the picture, there are a lot of architects breezing through town. Gabriella is in the middle of all of it. But we're just warming up, but we're going to wrap up. So, Alexander Paris is brought to Richmond because in about the time that she's building her new home with her husband, Dr. Brockenbrough. And he leaves, this is a native of Massachusetts, he leaves the Boston area to come here because President Jefferson has placed an embargo on traffic to Britain and in the Atlantic. Architectural jobs, and he's mostly a contractor, have dried up there. So he comes down to Richmond, the capital of a very prosperous place. And he gets the commission to design the executive mansion. So our governor's mansion here was built in 1813, designed by Alexander Paris of New England. The year before, 1812, Mr. Paris had designed for the Wickhams a house diagonally across the street from Gabriella and John. So certainly Alexander Paris would have been a figure in her education as an architectural aficionado. Next picture. And here, of course, is the beautiful Wickham House as it appears today. And this building also has the input of B. Henry Latrobe. As I read at the opening, Professor Lounsbury's words that buildings at this time were a kind of team effort, as it were. Mr. Paris had never designed a house of this magnitude. It was about twice the budget of what the state of Virginia was willing to pay for the governor's mansion. This has all the bells and whistles, and he sent his plans to be approved or to be remarked upon by the great B. Henry Latrobe, who was at that time working in Baltimore, I believe, on the new Catholic cathedral there. And shall we say, Mr. Latrobe was apoplectic about how wrong he thought everything was. So he basically rewrote the designs and the plans for the Wickham House. And of course, again, many hands, in this case, made for a great result, I think. So add another architect to Gabriella's table. Next picture, please. And there, of course, is the executive mansion. One quick way we know that the buildings aren't equal in their cost. The Wickham House is stuccoed and scored to look like stone. That was never done here at the executive mansion. The red brick was there for many years, and then later, to try to up the ante a little bit, it was painted a stone color. And that's how, as it appears today. Next image, please. Now, Mr. Paris would do all right. He would go back to Boston. He would design the Quincy Market, which is probably familiar to many of you, on the ocean front, on the wharf there in Boston. And he also designed, soon after getting there, a double portico structure, St. Paul's, Boston, Massachusetts. Well, of course, he had been, He had been staying or looking at the site across the street from Gabriella and John Brockenbrough's high-columned manse there at Clay and 11th Street. Next, 12th, I'm sorry. Now, Robert Mills comes back to Richmond in 1816 to design a city hall. Next picture. A new city hall for Richmond. And he's here for about 5 months. He does the designs and leaves. And next picture, please. When he leaves, the building is underway, but by no means finished. And a French architect by the name of Maximilien Godefroy arrives here, and he is also looking for work in the great Richmond and the great Commonwealth of Virginia. But he is brought here specifically, next picture. Well, he's going to, when he comes, he's going to look at the designs that Robert Mills did for the City Hall, and he totally reworks those. Can you see from where you are that there's a 360-degree rotunda in the center of this structure? When Mr. Mills left town, that was an oval. Mr. Godefroy came and said, we don't do ovals in Paris in great public buildings. That's going to be a proper circular room. He redid the columns and the fenestration on the outside of the building as well. So he got his fingers in that. Next picture, please. But the reason he was brought here, it was to re-landscape, or to landscape, because it was pretty much a muddy situation, the Capitol Square. And so it was Godefroy who did a very formal French garden approach. The axial arrangement between the Governor's Mansion and the Washington Monument and Grace Street today, it's a straight street, you may know, behind the Capitol building itself, is the best part remaining of his 1817 plan for this great park. Next picture, please. A little bit better here, we can see how he did alleys of trees coming down the hill from the Capitol building in a much more French tradition, much more classical, shall we say. And then you can see the road behind the Capitol, which has maintained its original intent, pretty much. In 1850, later on, when the picturesque becomes the cat's pajamas here and throughout America, more naturalistic landscaping, all of this will be wiped away by the plans of John Notman, which Cyan referred to earlier. Next picture. Now, while Mr. Godefroy is in town, and now we're getting to the link here, Godefroy had fled France. He was low aristocracy, I would say, but he had fled the revolution. He was marked probably for capture and execution. He had been a great traditionalist. He had studied the classical traditions of Greeks and the Romans. He had written books. He had published extensively. He brought quite a knowledge of the tradition of classicism if he hadn't done that many buildings. But Mr. Brockenbrough had then become the president of the Bank of Virginia because Mr. Venable, the president, had been killed in the Great Fire at the theater. So Mr. Brockenbrough and Mr. Wickham, who was the president of the Farmers Bank, go in together. Their buildings were next door to each other on East Main Street in the financial district, then the financial district as it pretty much still is. And they hired Mr. Godefroy to design them a classical colonnade connecting their two bank buildings. Now, I can't see Wells Fargo and Truist going in together to create a friendship arch, but this is what, another lecture, early banking versus now. So we can see this is in 1817. Well, what else happens in 1817? Next picture, please. Oh, first of all, we can see that then Mr. Godefroy, the same year, goes up to Baltimore, and some of you may be familiar with the handsome, landmark First Unitarian Church in Baltimore, again using 3 arches. He had cut his teeth, I guess, on these arches down on Main Street, and fortunately this building still stands. That building was consumed in the evacuation fire of 1865. Next picture, please. So, in 1817, when Mr. Godefroy is in town, Gabriella, or is that really Gabriella, and John Brockenbrough, that is an earlier portrait of John Brockenbrough, they decide they're going to build a new house. This is 7 years after they've built that large home on Clay Street. They buy 2 big lots, 2 blocks east at the corner of 12th and Clay Street. Next picture. They leave this house, next picture, and they move into what we know today to be the White House of the Confederacy. At the time, it was a 2-story building. The 3rd story was added in 1857 when the building was made, shall we say, more Italianate, including a cupola adorning the roof here. Next picture, please. But it's the back of the building that is always fascinated me, and the reason being there is no precedent in Richmond architecture, or I think in architecture on the East Coast at this time, for double columns, for double columned colossal colonnade like this. And I want us to think about what's going on here. The Great Theater Fire was 1811. Gabriella loses 2 siblings in that fire and a niece. This back porch overlooks the monumental church. It's in the next block. Both the monumental church backs up to Marshall Street, as does the Brockenbrough mansion. And so I believe, next picture, I believe this is Godefroy at work. Next picture, please. A building that Godefroy had studied extensively and he published work on was the east facade of the Louvre. And I believe that while he was here working with John Brockenbrough and Mr. Wickham on their bank project, he worked with Gabriella and her husband on their new house right down the street. And I think, if we can go back one picture, I think in some ways Gabriella was looking for something monumental to use a term, in her intent here. They bought the lot between this house and Marshall Street, and then they bought the lot to the east that tumbles down into Chaco Valley. Now, Gabriella is very well known and very well documented for being an outstanding gardener. Part of this is the fact that after the Brockenbroughs will leave this house, in about 1844, it is going to be prominent people there. It's going to be the White House of the Confederacy. It's going to be a school. And so many subsequent generations talk about and wrote about the beautiful gardens that were part of this estate in the city, if you will. Verena Davis, the First Lady of the Confederacy, wrote about this. And so we know for a fact that Gabriella's gardening architectural abilities were very well established. But what about this double column portico? If Robert Mills, who's often been given the credit for this building, had ever done anything close to this in Richmond, remember, they had just finished redoing his City Hall building with Mr. Godefroy. Mr. Godefroy was like a runaway train here in town, I think. And so this is what I'm suggesting this evening that we consider as the New York Times says, we begin to try to find new narratives for our stories here in Richmond. Next picture, please. Next. Next picture. We'll just go inside very quickly, and I want to show this. This is a floor plan of the Brockenbrough mansion. If we go to the next picture, what Gabriella and John Brockenbrough do they basically recreate what B. Henry Latrobe had done for Mr. Harvie, Gabriella's father, at his home, the Harvie house on Gamble's Hill. You can see the triple formal rooms on the south side of the house. Gabriella did not have the view of the river, but she had extensive gardens there, and by extension, the view and the vista to the east down today toward what would be Main Street Station would be very much a part of the scheme here. You can see that there is an oval entry hall, much smaller than what was over on Gamble's Hill, but the basic bones of the design are, for practical purposes, identical. Next picture. The garden that's there today was established in the 1960s. Next picture, please. So what of Gabriella? One of the reasons we don't know her name, I know many of you came in tonight never having heard of the lady. In 1828, Gabriella and her husband purchased Warm Springs, property that he already owned up in Bath County. And they opened in 1828 a resort hotel for the Springs in Warm Springs. Warm Springs has basically disappeared from our sites because the homestead at Hot Springs, just 5 miles away, has carried on with great distinction. But there were 2 large brick buildings here, very, very well-built buildings, and I think Gabriella would have enjoyed being up here, creating, in a sense, a kind of new health-oriented environment, having survived quite a bit of trauma in her time in Richmond. So she and her husband, John, will basically repair to the Springs in 1828. Next picture. Among the buildings that were already, that they built or restored or enlarged is the woman's bathhouse, which I'm happy to say just this past December was rededicated and restored through the Omni Homestead, which now owns this historic site, and much of the land of the Brockenbrough's old properties there. This was open to the public once again. So a good occasion and a good reason to go up to Warm Springs, where this bathhouse is located, to explore the territory, the western lands of the Brockenbroughs. Next picture, please. Indeed, Gabriella and John Brockenbrough are buried in a small cemetery there at Warm Springs, sort of in the middle of a very nondescript patch of grass, as it were. He passed away in 1853, and she created that large marker or large tomb for her husband, and she is at his side in the lower flat grave there. One person who would continue, I think, to look after the legacy there, their legacy there would be Mr. Brockenbrough's, Dr. Brockenbrough's brother author, Arthur Spicer Brockenbrough. He was the gentleman who built or oversaw the construction of the University of Virginia, which was a project that continued was getting underway in about 1818, early 1820s, when the Brockenbroughs began going up to Warm Springs. I think Dr. Brockenbrough enjoyed being with his brother there, and again, Gabriella would have been privy, and I'm sure would have enjoyed walking the lawn on the grounds at the university, creating yet another architectural experience in her extraordinary life. Thank you.
Please join us for drinks and nibbles in the room next door, and I'm sure Eddie would be delighted to continue the conversation in there. Thank you.
That interesting? Okay. Well, there are certainly very racy letters. I wish I had all those records.